Hello and welcome to today's video. Today I want to talk about why we have more than one theory of international politics. Why can't we just all agree on how international politics works? In fact, we can't do that. And what we find is that many people believe that they've come across the real way that international politics works. They believe they've found the key set of principles to understanding why states cooperate and why they compete, why they go to war, why sometimes they're at peace. So many people do believe that we can in fact have one unified, totally correct theory of international politics. The problem is that at the same time that those people believe that they've got the right theory, other people believe that they, possessing a completely different theory, are also simultaneously correct. Now this happens in all sorts of scientific endeavours. This happens in physics, this happens in chemistry, this happens in biology. There is more than one theory, certainly at different points in time in those disciplines as well. Contestation over which theory is correct is not in and of itself a bad thing. In fact, it's far from a bad thing. It is the very essence of science. But it's more problematic in the social sciences, like international relations. And why is that? It's more problematic because in the natural sciences, you would adjudicate between theories based upon what the data says. You might theorize, you might hypothesize that two chemical substances interact with each other to cause an explosion. And you would test this theory by going to a laboratory, by mixing these two substances together and seeing if there's an explosion. Bang! The theory's correct. No bang, back to the old drawing board. It's much more difficult to do that in international relations, in a social science. And it's difficult for several reasons. First of all, very difficult to do that in a social science because we don't have the equivalent of the experiment in the test tube. Our laboratory, if you like, is the real world. And our test tube, well, we don't really have a test tube. We don't have the ability to segment off parts of history or sections of the real world and just mix different elements together, just command people to do certain things to see if one of our theories is correct. It would of course be completely unethical to, for example, try and start a fight in a classroom to see if our theory of human conflict was right. In the real world, we also can't run an experiment more than once. If we had a theory of which chemical substances interact together and we had a laboratory, we could try and mix different ones of the chemical substances together in sequence. Let's say we've got 10 chemical substances. We'd mix 2 together, and then maybe we'd take the second one out and we put the third one with the first one, and then we put the fourth one with the first one, and then we put the fifth one with the first one, and so on, all in different sets of experiments, and we'd start to understand which substances interact with which other substances. We can't really do that in the real world, if by the real world we mean things that are going on day by day, and if by the real world we mean things that have happened in history. We can't go back to the Second World War and say, let's take Hitler out of the picture. Does the Second World War still happen? Does it still happen in the same way? We can't go back to the Second World War and say, let's make Churchill the Prime Minister of Britain earlier than he in fact became the Prime Minister of Britain. Let's take Neville Chamberlain, the guy who signed the Munich Agreement with Adolf Hitler, out of the picture. Let's put Churchill in his place. Churchill wouldn't have signed the Munich Agreement. Does that mean that World War I wouldn't have happened? We don't know, because we don't have a time machine.
Marty!
So with theories of international politics, we don't have the capacity to test them in the very direct way that we can test theories in the hard sciences. We don't have what's called experimental control. This doesn't mean, though, that we are completely without the ability to test theories at all, or to understand which theories are better than other theories. It just means it's a lot more difficult and there's a lot more conflict. What tools do we have in order to understand which are good theories and which are bad theories? Well, a lot of the time, we end up arguing over theories on two levels. We end up arguing over their basic principles. Are their basic principles, their basic foundational guesses about how the world works, plausible and correct? And we end up arguing over what data they are able to explain, what events or aspects of the real world they can in fact tell us a plausible story about. However, because we lack the ability to do experiments like the hard scientists do, this ends up becoming a very contested process. Let's take a simple example here. Let's take a theory of international politics that would focus purely on questions of power. Let's assume that this theory of international politics the basic principle of which is that power is what drives events in international politics, let's assume that this theory really wanted to tell us about the interactions between two countries, country A and country B. So what would that theory look like, and how would we go about understanding it? The basic principle at stake is the principle of power. But we immediately run into difficulties. What do we mean by power? Do we mean purely military power? Do we mean economic power? Do we mean the power of ideas? Do we mean the power of being morally correct? Do we mean peer pressure or some kind of social power? Already, by giving you a simple theory about power, saying that I want to concentrate on power, we've seen that immediately split into, 6 or 7 variants of that theory that define power in a different way. That's very different from the hard sciences, where you can say, I want to tell you about a bird, and you can objectively define what a bird is. And you can pick up a bird and touch a bird and measure a bird, and the bird has some sort of physical existence and physical essence in the way that this concept of power doesn't seem to have. The concept of power, is it military power? Is it peer pressure? Is it economic power? Is that what power is? That really depends upon what's going on in your head. And what's going on in your head might not be the same thing as what's going on in my head. What about data though? Surely we can get beyond this question of basic principles, definitions of basic principles, arguments about what it is proper to focus on in the world, and we can talk about data. Surely if we're interested in country A's power over country B, we can just look at what country A does and look at what country B does, and we can draw some sort of link that is going to help to tell us whether our theory of power is the right theory or the wrong theory. But again, we run into trouble almost immediately. Who is country A and who is country B? Let's say country A is the United States. Let's say country B is China. But what really is the United States? And what really is China? Do they have objective physical existence in the same way as an ant, a molecule, a bird? The United States is literally taken a landmass, and so is China. And yet what the United States means in international politics, what it means to you and me, is more than just a piece of dirt. So we see that even something as simple as naming the constituent parts of international politics, naming two countries and saying we want to study those relationships, immediately leads us into a thicket of imagined concepts, of socially defined concepts, of concepts that are not going to have the kind of objective existence that's going to allow us to definitively say the way that you are explaining international politics is correct. So what is the upshot of this? Well, the upshot is that we end up with not just one theory of international politics. We can't simply have one person say, I've worked out how the world works, we've got the best theory, and now we can all go home. Instead, we have layer after layer of theories. We have theories that compete with each other. We have theories that say broadly the same things using different terms. We have some theories that come along as successors and direct challenges to other theories, and we have, really crucially, zombie theories. Most theories in international politics never die. And why do most theories never die? It's because it's almost impossible to provide the kind of definitive test that would lead you to say, this theory isn't working, and it doesn't work, and it never can work, and we need to replace it with this other theory. Instead, theories become ideologies or stories that groups of people that look at the social world tell themselves and use to help them understand the social world. So I would put to you that finding a single right theory cannot be achieved. So if we're not going to find a single right theory, what use then do these theories have for us? How should we think of theories? What makes a good theory and what makes a theory that's not useful at all? We should think of theories as stories about the world that help us make sense of the world, that tell us where to look for what's important in the world. We should recognize that all theories come from a person or a group of people. They're born, they're imagined in a culturally specific time and place, responding to a specific set of circumstances, a specific set of understandings and problems. They should relate to facts. They should allow us to understand facts. They should put facts in their proper context. But they cannot simply be a collection of facts. They are, in fact, acts of imagination. I'm actually very jealous of these people who have these flashes of inspiration. that allow them to come up with revolutionary theories. I guess I've just never been in the right place, at the right time. Snacks. This has vital consequences for us in this class. This means that the theories that we're going to look at have to be seen as stories, and they have to be seen as stories that are imaginatively conjuring a world into existence rather than literally describing the world. A concept that might help us here is the concept of world building. If you engage in world building, you're trying to summon a plausible world into existence from your imagination. You're saying, imagine a world that works like this. Imagine a world with these types of people or things within it. Imagine a world that has these rules. We acknowledge, when we engage in world building, that the world of our imagination is not a literal description of the real world, because we know that that's impossible. But we do think, when we engage in world building, that the world that we imagine is going to tell us interesting things about our world. Everyone who comes up with a theory of international politics is engaging in world building. They're saying, I'm looking at the world, I'm imagining that it works according to these following principles. I'm imagining there are these types of things, these types of people who act according to these rules in the world. I know that this is not a literal description of reality, but I think that there's something useful in the world that I've created. I think that this world can tell us important things about our own world. This idea of world building doesn't come from social science, even though social scientists are invariably doing world building. This idea of world building comes from science fiction. In many ways, people who create science fictional worlds are doing the same thing as people who create theories of international relations. They're also often talking about similar types of activities like war and like peace and like political arrangements in imagined worlds. We'll see throughout this semester that we can gain a lot by drawing connections between science fictional worlds and between our world. But that's a story for another day.